today's video, we're going to focus in on the 1948 US presidential election. Now, this election was incredibly close. All the pundits thought that Thomas Dewey, who was running for the Republican Party, would beat Harry Truman, who was the sitting president already, but it didn't end up happening, right? So that's what we're kind of going to look into in this video. We're going to look at the different ways in which this election could have gone differently, and then also dive into some of the deeper history of it. But before we do all that, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, share one video with one friend, and also don't forget as well, we now have a Patreon account, so definitely check the link in the description there. So anyway, enough of my shameless plug, now let's get back into the rest of the video. Now, with regard to Harry Truman and him becoming the president, we've already covered quite a lot of the background of him in our video, which is What If Truman Never Became President? So definitely check that video out. There's quite a lot of overlap between this video and that, yeah, and there's certain things that we're not going to include in this one, which we're including in that, so definitely check that out. But in this video, we're going to focus more on some of the other characters and also more specifically on some of the things that Truman did, which are very particular with regard to this election. So first of all, we're going to talk about Thomas Dewey, right? So Thomas Dewey was a moderate Republican. So back in the day, the Republican Party tended to be a lot more liberal and a lot more moderate than it is today. Now, you think about the Republican Party, you think of conservatism, but this was not really the case yet up until the presidency of Ronald Reagan, where the Republican Party was solidly a conservative force. So before this, you had a lot more of a liberal tinge. And Thomas Dewey, for instance, when he was the governor of New York, he doubled the amount of state funding which went towards education, and he also increased the pay for state employees as well. So basically, the kind of liberal / moderate Republicans, what they wanted was basically, when it came to foreign policy, they were very much interventionists and stuff. They were so-called cold warriors, but also they tend to be very internationalist. They were pro the UN and pro basically the Truman doctrine, but they just wanted it to be even tougher than Truman was. However, when it came to domestic policies, they tended to very much support many of the New Deal policies that were proposed by FDR and by the Democrats in general. And where they differed was that they wanted there to be balanced budget, right? So although Dewey did increase the amount of money in New York that went to all these provisions, it was a thing where he still, balanced the budget and also was paying off the state's debt. So this is essentially what the liberal / moderate Republicans wanted. They wanted to have the New Deal, but they wanted it to basically be done on the cheap. In the famous words of Thomas Dewey, he wanted, as he called it, pay-as-you-go liberalism. He said that government can be progressive and solvent at the same time. So that was basically, what he kind of wanted to do. However, the part of the problem with Thomas Dewey is that, so he'd run in 1940 as a non-interventionist, like most Americans prior to Pearl Harbor, they didn't want to get involved in the war, so that was the platform that he stood on then. Then in 1944, he ran and actually was on the ticket for the Republican Party, so he ran against FDR, and in that one there, he had become a lot more pro-interventionist. And by 1948, he'd become even more pro-interventionist. So the problem with Dewey is that people kind of labelled him as being a bit of an opportunist, as being a kind of seeing which way the wind blows kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? Like he was accused even by people within his own party of so-called Me Tooism, right? Which is kind of not to be confused with that modern movement, of course, but basically just kind of saying, oh yeah, I like that as well. So he tended to support policies which were popular, but it was a thing of, what do you actually want to do as president? What are the things that you want to do? How would you govern differently from what the Democratic Party is trying to do? So this was a big kind of problem here, that he was very vague with regard to what he wanted to do as president. And also the fact that he was of the so-called Eastern establishment, which was basically very pro-business kind of elites, it kind of made him very detached from ordinary people. So people kind of thought, well, he's in favour of big business, in favour of this and that, but it's a thing where we don't really trust him, we don't really like him, and we don't really know what he's going to do for people like us. And it didn't help also that he was overly reliant on opinion polls, right? He almost had a kind of religious zeal for opinion polls. And opinion polls, they're not to be dismissed, they are important, but at the same time, there's still a margin of error. and opinion polls also change as well. So while it's important to keep an eye on them, it's a thing where you shouldn't, run your campaign based purely on how you're doing in opinion polls. And this is the thing: he didn't attack Truman. Like, this is one of the major things. Yeah, I always say when you're running an election, there's three things you have to do, right? So you have to energize the base, you have to appeal to moderates, and you have to demonize the opposition, right? So, so on the first one, energizing the base, who are his base really? How are you getting people to come out and campaign for you? What are you really running on? Are they really clear when at the doorstep what you're kind of campaigning for? What are they arguing with people at the doorstep for? And then, appeal to moderates. Yeah, he did that. Tick, you appeal to moderates. But then when it comes to demonizing the opposition, you didn't do that, right? So it was a thing where, Truman didn't have this kind of hang up at all, right? Truman labeled like the GOP as basically standing for grand old platitudes. Yeah, he basically said that they were talking generalities and that, there was nothing of any kind of substance that they were actually running on. And also, although Dewey was far more moderate than many of the other Republicans in Congress, Truman attached his candidacy to this conservative Republican Congress, which he labelled as the so-called do-nothing Congress. Now, the 80th Congress, you could say a lot of things about them, but you can't really label them as do-nothing, right? This is the Congress which passed the Marshall Plan. This is the one which passed the Truman Doctrine. And this was the one that passed the Taft-Hartley Act, right? So the Taft-Hartley Act was an anti-trade union law. So it restricted the power of labor unions in America. So again, you can support these things, you can disagree with these things, but these are pretty significant pieces of US government legislation. And in terms of foreign policy with like the Marshall Plan and like the Truman Doctrine, it's quite difficult to say that this was a do-nothing Congress, but nonetheless, Truman ran against the Republican Party, basically saying that they were do-nothing Congress. But something to note is that in this election, the Republican Party was not the only opposition that the Democrats had to face. As a matter of fact, Harry Truman had to deal with people within his own ranks, yeah, and this was one of the main things that made this election incredibly interesting, because this election represents an election of de-alignment, yeah. So every now and again in American history, there's like certain pivotal points, yeah, where you can see the different political parties begin to shift, yeah, and you can see kind of echoes of what's going to come later, yeah, like kind of and the 1948 election was basically a precursor for a lot of what you'd see in like the 1960s and stuff. And this is mainly because in 1948, under the kind of New Deal coalition, you had Northern Democrats, who were like liberal and progressive, etc. And then you also had Southern Democrats who tend to be more conservative. They were in favour of states' rights, and they were also pro-segregationist, right? So these two camps were brought together under the New Deal, and basically because both sides, supported like the extra government spending. But on social issues, the two groups were very, very different. And this is kind of what you start to see in this election. So Henry Wallace, who discussed in that previous video about Truman, right, he had been the vice president under FDR. However, in the 1944 Democratic Convention, Truman ended up taking over from him because people saw him as being too progressive and they wanted someone who's a bit more moderate, right? And that's how Truman ended up getting the job in the first place. So Henry Wallace was still very, very embittered from this. And so he split off and formed the Progressive Party. So they were basically running on desegregation. They were running on a very progressive platform, like kind of, for a repeal of the Taft-Hartley Act and all these kind of things, right? Yeah, and also Wallace, when he was doing campaigning, he spoke in front of like desegregated crowds, yeah. So crowds where black people and white people were like intermixed and stuff. And he did this both in the north and in the south, yeah. And like, he even got like eggs and like tomatoes and stuff thrown at him. So it was a thing where, in today's world, we see that as being very obviously progressive and ahead of its time. But in 1948, it was incredibly unpopular and stuff, right? So, he didn't have much chance of actually winning, but it did still take votes away from the Democratic Party. Yeah, and on the flip side, you had the Southern Democrats, yeah, who, were famously referred to as the dixiecrats. And these were people who were very staunchly in favour of segregation, in favour of Jim Crow. And they wanted the Southern states to have the right to maintain, the system of Jim Crow, in spite of what people in the North would have wanted. So at the end of World War II, Harry Truman began to shift his perspective on race, right? Now, in today's world, we'd see him as being, a white supremacist and, a virulent racist. However, for the time, he was quite progressive. And what I mean by this is, coming at the end of World War II, he saw a lot of like returning black GIs coming from from Europe and from like Pacific and stuff. So people who had like worn American uniforms, who fought for America in World War II, they were returning to America, and they came back to many places in the South. But when they returned to the South, they were being mistreated by the people there. So although they were wearing US Army uniforms, there were many, many stories where they were being brutalized in the street. And like this kind of flew in the face of what America had been fighting for. America was, fighting for freedom and fighting against like kind of Nazism, etc., etc. But at home, their troops were being discriminated against, and being persecuted. So this was something which kind of shifted Harry Truman's perspective. And he even famously said this famous quote, "My forebears were Confederates, but my very stomach turned when I had learned that Negro soldiers, just back from overseas, were being dumped out of army trucks in Mississippi and beaten." So this gives you an idea of what the kind of situation was, So even though they're wearing US Army uniform, they're still getting beaten up in states like Mississippi. So this spurred him, when he became president, to set up the President's Committee on Civil Rights, and this was in 1946 to 47. And this kind of led to a lot of executive orders where he sought to, desegregate the federal workforce, desegregate the military, impose federal protections against lynchings. Up until that time, FDR had like stayed away from all these kind of policies. He didn't even want to have like photos taken with himself and black people. And this was just to keep like the Southern dixiecrats like kind of on side. But Truman, he took a very principled stand against this, and even with regard to the elimination of poll tax, right? So poll tax, this is what we've discussed in a previous video as well, with regard to the 24th Amendment. So many of the southern states, black people were disenfranchised, so they weren't able to vote because many of them were too poor to be able to pay for a certain poll tax, right? So this was a way of keeping black voters away from being able to vote at election time. So this is one of the things that he pushed for in like the late 1940s, and this didn't end up becoming a constitutional amendment up until 1964. So this was really, really ahead of its time. However, it obviously led to a split within the Democratic Party, and many people within the South, led by Thurmond, they split away and formed the States' Rights Democratic Party, or as we more commonly kind of know it, the Dixiecrat Party. Now, the goal for Dixiecrats in this election was not to win the presidential election. They knew that outside the South they would not have enough support, and so that wasn't really their aim. But their aim was basically to become the kingmakers for this election. So the idea was basically this, that if they were able to win enough states and get enough electoral college votes, then they could basically, be the kingmakers in this election. Because under the 12th Amendment of the US Constitution, it stipulates that if a majority of electoral college votes are not secured by one candidate, then the vote goes to the House of Representatives, and they are then able to decide on who the next president will be. So the idea was basically that, within this very conservative Congress, what would basically happen is that, they would be able to pick who they wanted, and if it was decided that the Republican Party was more in favour of maintaining these states' rights for the Dixiecrats, then the Dixiecrat candidates would switch parties and vote for the Republicans. If, however, the Democratic Party pulled back on its more progressive thing and basically was like, oh, we want to keep these people within the Democratic Party, then they would have to, pick Harry Truman, but Harry Truman would have to reverse many of the kind of civil rights legislation that he'd put in place. So people like Senator Humphrey at the 1948 Democratic Convention, when he said that the Democratic Party should get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. So this was basically the vibe of many Northern Democrats stuff, right? However, in order to keep the Southern Democrats in place, you basically have to reverse much of that rhetoric, much of those policies, and so the Democratic Party would be very firmly in favour of states' rights and maintain this Jim Crow legacy far into like the future and stuff. So This is kind of what we're going to get into a little bit later in the video with the alternative scenario, right? In terms of how this would completely change the makeup of like US politics, yeah, in the preceding decades. And in fairness, the Dixiecrats did have a point, because if you look at the 1952 US presidential election, you look at 1956, in both those cases, most of the Democratic Party's support is in the South. So without the support of these Southern Dixiecrats, they wouldn't have had almost any electoral college votes at all. And then you look at 1960 with the election of JFK, it's a situation where without the vote of these Southern Dixiecrats, JFK would never have actually been elected as president. And we covered that in the previous video as well, of just how close that presidential election was. So, you know, it's a thing where throughout like the next decade at least, you can kind of see just how much power the Dixiecrats had. And so the Democratic Party in the North having to push against like all this kind of desegregation, yeah, this is why LBJ said in 1964 when he signed the Civil Rights Act, he said the Democratic Party has lost the South for about 50 years. And that's very much true, even to this day, for various different reasons. The parties didn't switch purely on this issue, but this was one of the contributing factors. Yeah, like, so it's a situation where the parties switched from, you know, the Democratic Party being the party of the South to the Republican Party becoming more and more the party of the South, and the Democratic Party being more and more the party of the North. You know, so you can start to really see the indications of this in the 1948 election. This is when like the preceding 20 or 30 years of US politics really begins to shift. So now that we've covered the basic history of the 1948 election, what we're going to do is we're going to imagine two separate scenarios, yeah? One in which Dewey wins on his own merits without the help of the Dixiecrats, and the other, we're going to focus on the Dixiecrats and if it had ended up going to Congress.